I was shocked in 2000, sitting in the audience of Perfecting Church, to see George Bush standing before me. And I'm amazed at how George Bush corralled sort of a value principle coalition, if you will, and reached out to black pastors and really embedded himself in black churches. And I'm wondering if the immigration issue isn't that Nordisue sort of new coalition value for Republicans, and if they will be able to build a broader based coalition around the immigration issue in the next election cycle.
Thank you. Cornell or Margie, did you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is that also, I mean, there's the issue piece of it, but there's also a difference between the candidates. And again, I feel like I've said now 2 nice things about George W. Bush, which is not something I do very often, but he at least had he gave off the vibe that he liked the voter, right? At least you could say that about him, at least in contrast to Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney just never had that comfort with his fellow man, fellow woman, fellow voter, in a way that, you know, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean one thing or the other versus what their policies are or what kind of people they are per se, but in terms of as candidates, I think that is a very big difference between George W. Bush and one of his strengths and something that Mitt Romney was just never going to be able to make up ground. And it's not that, you know, President Obama doesn't have the Bill Clinton gene in the way that Bill Clinton had it, but ultimately it was light years ahead of where Mitt Romney is in terms of the ability to, you know, connect with voters in a real way. And I think that's what you know, that's a lot of why Bush did better with, you know, across the board than you ever could see Mitt Romney do.
Cornell.
And let me jump in and add to that. I mean, there are also sort of 2 things that have occurred. One really important, and that one is actually a reaction to President Obama, is that's the rise of the Tea Party. Look, I think the Tea Party has pulled the Republican Party so far to the right and made them, I think, all the sort of worst elements, I would argue, of the right are sort of encapsulated in the Tea Party, because I actually don't buy this bullshit that the Tea Party is about deficits. I know what the Tea Party is about. It's about changing America, and it's a reaction to the changing of America. So you have a Tea Party that is openly sort of hostile, and I say that because actually a couple months ago we did a poll for BET, and looking at African Americans in battleground states, and you know what correlates strongest to dislike or unfavorability to the Republican Party happens to be the trait or characteristic, 2 things. One is sort of who's fighting for the expansion of opportunity and civil rights, and the other thing is which party do you perceive to be openly hostile to minorities? To minorities. Overwhelming majority of African Americans see the Republican Party as openly hostile to minorities, and that in fact correlates strongest with their unfavorability. So they have a real problem with some of the rhetoric and some of the policy and some of the people who are front and center of the Republican Party, who African Americans and Hispanics, I would say rightfully see as somewhat openly hostile to people of color. The other part about this, I'll say, is once upon a time Republicans under Bush, and even sort of their chairman, who was like Melman, actually had this ideal of reaching out to minorities.
Gillespie did as well.
Right, to reaching out to minorities. That has gone to the wayside. Sort of this ideal of reaching out to the minorities. Although I would argue that they will again. And then there's this other piece that when you look at the minorities, and this is going to be mean. It's going to sound meaner than it is. I don't really mean it to be mean. But if you look at the minorities and the younger people that they actually have around the Republican Party, who are their outreach people who are working for, you know, the Romney campaign or the Republican Party, I would argue that those minorities are so woefully out of the mainstream of the communities that they hope to sort of speak for, that they in fact hurt the Republican Party more than they help the Republican Party.
Thank you. I want to get the young man in the red shirt, young woman in the pink jacket, gentleman in the gray jacket, and then I'll get some more. Yes, sir.
My question is for Jeff and for Cornell. President Obama has been a great president in the last 4 years. President Obama has been a great president in the last 4 years. Particularly, we talked about on this platform how he's, you know, being reelected on the wings of black and brown people, if you will. However, there are some issues in black and brown communities, when we talk about the war on drugs, we talk about mass incarceration that weren't addressed at the DNC, weren't really addressed by President Obama. Besides the fact that,
Your question.
besides the fact that the right wing kind of looks at Obama as a socialist, and if he were trying to do some things to help out these communities, what other factors do you think are affecting Obama's reluctance to speak on these issues or to put forth some kind of policies?
Well, Cornell's much more sophisticated than I in this regard. I will just say that I am growing more and more frustrated with black people in particular, asking the president to address, in some cases, issues that he doesn't need to address. The second thing, that are not federal issues. I think the second thing is that I am angry with the fact that there is a perception that he is supposed to come into office with that agenda versus us in a very sophisticated way pushing that agenda. And so while I think there have been some areas where I personally believe the president has not been as courageous as I think he can be, I think we has also not been as diligent as we can be in forcing the hand of the president to address some issues that otherwise he should address. Cornell and I have been in meetings before where we've said to certain groups, and they will remain nameless, that there is no consequence for the president not doing what it is they ask him to do. And so there are African-American groups that say, Mr. President, we want this. He says no. They say, thank you very much. And so at some point, there has to be a level of engagement, and we can decide whether that is diplomatic engagement or we can decide whether that's aggressive engagement. But you can't complain about LGBT community getting certain things they wanted, Latino community getting certain things that they wanted, members of the women demographic getting what they wanted when they were aggressive in challenging the president in certain areas to address some of their policy needs. African Americans, I don't think, have been sophisticatedly aggressive in doing that. And until that happens, a lot of those issues and others that you mentioned won't get addressed.
And I would only add this, and amen to that. I would only add this. As a strategy, look at what the Tea Party did in Congress. I mean, as a strategy, as a political strategy, look at, in fact, what the Tea Party did. I mean, there were a handful of Tea Partiers who got into the Republican caucus and decided that they would, in fact, play politics the way, quite frankly, you have to play politics if you're going to move your agenda, and you know you don't have the votes. And let's be clear, for most of the stuff that they want, they don't have the votes for it. But they've been very effective at moving their agenda without the votes. Now, how many, what we got, 44, 42, 46 members of the Congressional Black Caucus? 47, 46, well, there's a lot of them. And along with the Hispanic caucus, there shouldn't be, now I'm getting in trouble, there shouldn't be an agenda that moves through Congress that the Hispanic and Congressional Black Caucus shouldn't have their fingerprints on in some way. But you have to, play the tactics that I think, quite frankly, the Tea Party has played. You may love or hate the Tea Party, but you can, as sort of a political tactician, you have to admire the way they have used their power, in fact, move an agenda and get what they want without the votes.
In the back, yes, ma'am, with the pinks.
Lisa Hasegawa at the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. Thanks, Christine, for covering some of our poll results. I'll talk about them a little bit more later. My question is, I think you guys have kind of touched on this already, so I'm just going to encourage you to go further. We've talked about how communities of color, I think a lot of the poll results have showed that, I think that there's a lot more alignment on policy issues in terms of raising taxes on the wealthy, in terms of social safety net programs, in terms of health insurance, affordable housing. Our poll definitely showed that. So where are there some policy opportunities? And I think that what you were talking about is also not just getting somebody elected, but the next challenge is really around governance. How do we really come together in a much more, I think, structured way
Thank you.
to be able
Great
to
question.
do that? Thanks.
Did one person on the panel want to take that?
Well, she knows me, so you can Well, I actually wanted to say something that is somewhat addressing that, but I think also connects to the last question. I think on the issue of immigration as a policy concern, there was a great deal of ambivalence among at least leadership within the Latino community about how much to be all in for President Obama in this reelect, given that people felt like he had not delivered in the ways that people had expected, and in light of the fact that there really in '08 had been fairly significant vote and support for him from the Latino community. I think that the pseudo Dream Act, mini Dream Act, whatever you want to call it, is pretty much considered a down payment toward what people, I think we're going to start hearing some demands from folks in the Latino community, particularly in light of the fact that our key positioning in these battleground states really was quite influential in, sealing the deal for 2012 election. And so I think that that's one of the policies that, as I mentioned before, it's like a thing to do to get it and move on beyond it. And then I think it's going to be the really, sort of what the whole point of this conference is about, right? The closing that wealth gap thing, which gets directly at the question of housing and, foreclosure issues, investments in communities, the redlining, hopefully now greenlining way to approach a lot of those things, because that's where, for the Latino community, so much of our wealth really is, all sitting in the houses that have, had incredible drops over the last 5-6 years in their value. That's the money that people will send their kids to college on if they're able to.
And African American community the same.
Exactly, yeah.
So thank you for that. I want to try to get to as many questions as I can before we close out. I'm sorry, Karen.
No, they asked me to stay in the Q&A, I'm going to go.
Oh, yes, sir, in the back.
I can speak without a microphone, but hope this doesn't count for my 30 seconds. The question really simply put, and then I'll give it a brief context, is how do we improve the data so we can tell a better story? Because folks on this panel have talked about exit polling when the networks for the first time cut 19 states out of their exit polling, and one of those states, guess what, was North Dakota. Another state was Alaska. In the last 2 cycles, we would have had less strong exit polling data to tell our story if this decision persists. And unfortunately, we'd be more concerned about that decision if exit pollers even asked, are you Native or are you Asian in some parts of the country? So I think that question, as well as the weakness of census data, to the point Karen made about...
I'm going to let you stop there so
Okay.
we can address that question. Margie or Cornell in particular?
Well, it's certainly, it's a huge challenge. I mean, the challenge of cutting, cost saving for news outlets, the challenge of cell phones and early voting, exit polls, they have to account for early voting. It all becomes, and the immediacy with which we want results, all of those things are pressures that build here that are causing a huge problem that, by and large, have not caused a major problem, but at the margins or in some states or in some cases can indeed cause a huge problem. So, I think this is something that's really evolving. I think one of the things that is a good outcome, though, and this is not exactly your question, but I think it's still important to note, is there was a lot of talk about the polls being unreliable generally headed into the election and the unskewing of the polls, and they're all wrong, and there's this conspiracy that everyone goes up to the highest level of everything, and it turns out that by and large the polls were right, that all the aggregators taken together, looking at all the polls across outlets, showed that by and large they were able to predict with some accuracy what was going to happen. So I think that is a good outcome, but yeah, these are big challenges that I don't have the answer, and I don't know if the exit pool has the answer.
The gentleman in the aisle, and I guess is that lavender? I can't tell from the light. There you go. And then the gentleman in the front. Those are the last 2 questions that we can take before we have to close this panel out.
Thank you. It's my daughter's favorite color, so I had to wear it.
I just wanted to make sure my eyes were good from here.
So thank you so much for this. My question is this. I want to understand, and maybe folks have some insights on the panel around this question. It feels like the Republicans are much more scared of their base than we are. I just haven't heard Obama say, oh my God, here come the single payer folks, look out. Can people please explain that to me?
Thank you. Anyone?
Let me take it on first. Because here's, I think, is where Occupy Wall Street missed it. I mean, there could be a lot of similarities between Occupy Wall Street and the rise of the Tea Party, except this one thing. The Tea Party organized, and they took that organization and put it into politics. Occupy Wall Street didn't do that. I mean, I think how different would you think things would look politically if there were, in fact, Occupy Wall Streeters challenging Democrats in primaries? And therein is the problem. You have Tea Partiers challenging Republicans in the primaries, forcing this conversation. There's no Occupy Wall Streeters challenging people in primaries. I, quite frankly, look, and I don't want to beat on Occupy Wall Street, but I don't know where the hell they are. But it was such energy and such sort of promise. But, and this is the problem with sort of liberals, I think, in general, is, you know, we have all this sound and this fury, but we don't organize. They organize and they challenge people. There's no challenges from the Occupy Wall Street. I mean, no Democrat running for Congress is fearful that he's going to be challenged, he or she's going to be challenged by Occupy Wall Street.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
This question is for the entire panel. What are you doing? Okay. What are you doing to address the issue of the 50% of young people who are dropping out of high school? When we talk about the electorate, we talk about wealth, inequality, job opportunity, unprepared workforce. What are your organization, or what are we legislatively trying to do to address?
I think to make sure we focus the question on where we are as a panel, we talked a little bit about down ballot voting, and we haven't talked about how this year's election will affect in any way, shape, or form what's going to happen in a little under a year in local elections in 2013, where there will be school board elections, mayoral elections, well, more local elections that will affect in some cases, I think, policy that speaks to his question. So if any of you want to, Christine, if you want to take that.
Yeah, I know for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we've actually seen a growth of AAPIs running for school board. So because education has been such an issue, and there's actually a wide variety of diversity. We're really not just the model and minority, but we actually have a good number of the community who also don't have access to higher education and education access. But I mean, so I really think that it really is about carrying this conversation not every 4 years, but it's really about how do we continue to have these nonprofit organizations and our community and voters to actually continue to engage and to also pay attention to these local elections.
I want to say thank you because we are pressed for time, and I want to make sure that we honor the next panel. Clearly, I'm getting a message.
So if you're asking questions about policy education, that's the what's next. How do you turn the electoral power into policy power on education, health, income security? So stick around after the break.
Yes, but I think that there's multiple levels, because a lot of what has been discussed here is about how do we begin to engage in a culture of civic engagement, not engage in electoral cycles, and that is part of the challenge that we're facing, and hopefully where us as an audience as well as the panel will begin to take us as we go to the next phase. So if we can, give a round of applause to Cornell Belcher, Christine Tin, Tiffany Smalley, Julie Martinez Ortega, and Margie. Say that for me.
O'Mara.
I said it right the first time. O'Mara. Please give them a round of applause, and thank you so much. We're going to take a